When one thinks of literature, you might think of Shakespeare, Robert Frost, J.K. Rowling, all of whom are from Europe or America. Typically, Africa is not known for its literary works. In fact, it wasn't until the Europeans arrived that Africa had a writing system. So why have I brought you here today? I thought it'd be interesting to shed some light on Africa's famous writers and the history of writing itself. According to Wendy Laura Belcher of Princeton University, one of the most common assumptions about Africa is that it has no indigenous writing systems. And that simply is not true. In the early days of man, none of us had writing. Everything we learned was by word of mouth. It just so happens that Africans stood by that longer than the rest of the world. Oral tradition is used all around the world. It's not a new concept. In fact, it's thousands of years old. Oral tradition isn't the only form of literature that early Africans had. Another quote from Belcher says, "African rock art is perhaps the oldest art in the world, dating at least 77,000 years ago. These cave paintings describe stories of rituals, celebrations, and even symbolism in talking about cosmology, otherwise known as the creation of the frickin' universe." While at a first glance it appears that early Africa had no writing system, it just wasn't in the traditional style that we're used to nowadays. I mean, look at the Egyptians. They were advanced as heck and didn't use real words. They used hieroglyphs, which Egypt was located in Africa, so. As Africa moved on to the world, Egypt eventually adopted an alphabet called Coptic. Some of the earliest Coptic stories we have are short magical tales, but some also depict biblical stories. Some of the earliest genres used in this alphabet were life stories, legends, poetry, and religious commentaries. Sadly, most of the Coptic stories were made untranslated to this day. They didn't just stick to that though. They started with Coptic, moved to however you pronounce this, which is also sometimes referred to as Classic Ethiopian, and to Libyo-Berber. Libyo-Berber was used for over 2,000 years and was primarily found in areas above the Sahara. Even to this day, we haven't found the oldest piece of writing in Libyo-Berber. Some of the most important and least known scripts were written in this language, but sadly, we cannot translate these texts because most of the knowledge of the language has been lost to time. Then the Greeks and Romans came in and started writing in Latin, with one notable writer being Saint Augustine. He was born in Algeria into a Berber family. Yeah, not Roman. He grew up speaking his native Berber language and eventually learned to speak and write in Latin. And with these new skills, produced hundreds of texts written in Latin. And probably as a surprise to many Christians, many early Christian documents were written in these African languages. These included biographies and autobiographies of African saints, like our buddy Augustine. But all that happened before and during our good pal Jesus. So let's talk about something more recent. In other words, the Afro-colonial era. So when Europeans first arrived, they were like, these guys have no writing system. They must be idiots. Let's help them out. Unfortunately, their idea of helping was enslaving them while simultaneously stealing all their land and resources. Because these people were enslaved and brought to other countries, they actually learned those languages. Africans began speaking French, English, and many other languages, but they didn't just speak them. No. They also wrote in these languages. For the first time in thousands of years, the African continent had an established writing system, according to the Europeans. This era for Africa was huge in terms of literature. What came out of this were stories about slaves and their lives in shackles, and even their opinions on colonialism and the colonists while they were still enslaved. One famous example is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Achebe addressed the effects of colonialism on traditional African society in his book and received worldwide acclaim for it. Some very common themes Africans were writing about in this time were liberation and independence, which might not sound all that surprising. Slave narratives also became common and were some of the first pieces of African literature to grab the attention of the West world. Africans also used a newspaper to air their views on certain issues, translated their plays into English, and wrote poetry. One notable African poet is none other than Phillis Wheatley. Taken to America around the mid-18th century and was bought by the Wheatley family in Boston, Massachusetts. Susanna Wheatley took pity on the girl, seeing as she was only a child. The Wheatleys taught Phillis how to read and write, among other subjects such as geography and history. Phillis Wheatley's first poem was published when she was only 13, in the Newport, Rhode Island Mercury in December of 1767. In 1773, the first collection of poetry written by an African-American poet was published. That, of course, was Phillis Wheatley's poems on various subjects, religious and morals. As her popularity grew, she was eventually freed, she married, and she published a book called An Elegy, sacred to the memory of that of the great divine, the Reverend and learned Dr. Samuel Cooper. Unfortunately, her husband died very shortly after the publication, and she became very poor and died December 5th, 1784, with nothing to her name. Once Europe decided to leave Africa alone, the literature started to develop quite a bit. In fact, literature has been on the increase, and African authors have found their books worked into the Western curriculum for schools. Modern African literature also developed some common themes in their works. Some examples include Africans' past versus their present, tradition versus modernity, and individualism versus community. African writers also began to be recognized for their works, one prominent author being Wole Soyinka. Soyinka is a Nigerian playwright, poet, novelist, and essay writer in English. He was also the first African writer to win a Nobel Peace Prize post-independence. He has also been a loud and outspoken critic of the Nigerian government, causing him to have been arrested and run away several times. When the civilian rule was restored in 1999, he was made Professor Emeritus of the University of Ife, now known as Obafemi Awolowo University. If there's one thing you could take away from the presentation, is that this is a really cool video. But if there's another thing I'd want you to take away from this, it'd be that Africa isn't what we think it to be. We may not think of literature when we think of Africa, but we know that writing in this continent goes back thousands and thousands of years. Just because a bunch of white guys say, hey, these guys are idiots, doesn't mean that they were right. Africa is rich in history and writing. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Oh boy, oh boy.